30 minutes ago, the first shaky phone videos started leaking out of central Israel. Brief flashes of orange, a low rolling thud, car alarms screaming in chorus, and then the sound that always comes next. Silence, like the city itself is holding its breath. 12 minutes ago, emergency radio traffic spiked. Fragmented, coded, and suddenly crowded with one word that should never be said casually in a coastal megacity: grid. And 2 minutes ago, the official channels and went strangely quiet. Here's what we can say based on emerging reports and geolocated clips. While acknowledging authorities have not fully confirmed the scope, Tel Aviv has suffered an UDER, a strike consistent with an Iranian Shahab-3 class medium-range ballistic missile impact. But listen carefully, because this is the part that changes everything. Not an IDF base, not Ben Gurion Airport, but the civilian spine. The energy and water nexus that keeps Greater Tel Aviv alive. High-voltage switching infrastructure feeding the Dan metropolitan load, and the pumping systems that depend on it. This is not just a strike on a city. This is a strike on metabolism, because when you hit power in a modern coastal city, you don't just dim lights. You disrupt desalination, pressure pumps, hospital sterilization, elevators, refrigeration, traffic control, life support in slow motion. Roughly 4 million people in the greater Tel Aviv area sit downstream of that reality. 4 million human beings who are now calculating, consciously or not, how long until the water slows, how long until the cell towers die, how long until the supermarkets turn into empty shelves and arguments, and through it all, the most unsettling detail: government silence, not reassurance, not clarity, not here's what was hit and here's what's next. Just an information vacuum where panic breeds fastest. In the next few minutes, I'm going to map this out with absolute precision, because this story is not about explosions. It's about systems. Here's what we'll cover: what the Shahab-3 represents in practical military terms, and why that matters for Tel Aviv's defense assumptions. What was likely targeted, and why it's not symbolic, but biological. Water pressure, power stability, and urban survival. How infrastructure failure translates into human behavior. Not politics, not ideology, but panic economics and survival psychology. And the question nobody wants to ask out loud: what happens next if the strike pattern shifts from military targets to civilian survival targets? Quickly, if you value analysis that doesn't insult your intelligence, thank you for being here. Your support is what keeps this channel independent and functioning when information gets messy. So before we go deeper, subscribe, hit like, and share this, because the more people who see careful breakdowns, the harder it is for any side to hide behind fog and silence. Now let's talk about what was actually hit and why this is not damage, it's disconnection. To understand why this strike is different, you have to understand Greater Tel Aviv as a living machine. A modern city doesn't run on electricity the way a house does. It runs on layers: generation, transmission, substations, distribution feeders, plus the digital nervous system on top, SCADA, load balancing automation, and protective relays designed to prevent a surge from tearing the whole network apart. Tel Aviv's coastal corridor is fed by a web of high-voltage transmission, and think 161 kV and above, step down through major substations into medium-voltage distribution that feeds neighborhoods, hospitals, and industrial loads. The critical point isn't a single power plant, it's the switching and transformation nodes, the places where electricity is routed, stepped down, and stabilized. Now connect that to water. Israel's coastal cities depend heavily on desalination, reverse osmosis plants that don't just filter water. They run high-pressure pumps, pushing seawater through membranes at extreme pressures, then pushing clean water into pressure grids and storage reservoirs. No stable power means no stable pressure. No pressure means the system doesn't gracefully degrade. It fails in pockets. Some districts lose flow first, then others. Then contamination risk rises as pressure drops and backflow becomes possible. This is why the target matters. A strike on a runway is disruption. A strike on an ammunition depot is degradation. But a strike on power-water interdependence is something else entirely. This is not about taking territory, it's about taking time, stealing hours from a city's ability to function, and converting those hours into fear, anger, and political pressure. That's why a Shahab-3 class weapon, if it indeed hit this type of node, would be chosen. Not because it's the most accurate, not because it's the most modern, but because a heavy warhead impacting near a switching yard or transformer field can create a cascading outage that spreads far beyond the crater. Let's talk about the weapon, because the physics explains the panic. The Shahab-3 is a medium-range ballistic missile family. It's not a drone. It's not a short-range rocket. It's a high-arc projectile that re-enters fast, carrying a warhead often estimated in the 700 to 1,000 kilogram class, depending on variant. Even with imperfect accuracy, that mass is the point. You don't need to thread a needle when you're aiming at a system. And here's the critical reframing. This is not a broken window problem. It's not even a repair problem. It's a replacement problem. because when a ballistic impact hits near power infrastructure, the damage is rarely neat. The shockwave and fragmentation can shred control cabling, destroy protective relays, and, most importantly, rupture large power transformers filled with insulating oil. Those fires don't just burn, they contaminate and warp metal, destroy bushings, and compromise switchgear alignment, and large transformers are not spare parts you pull off a shelf. They are long, lead, custom-fitted components, often requiring specialized transport, heavy cranes, and weeks to months of procurement under normal conditions. Under wartime conditions, with ports pressured and supply chains tense, that timeline stretches. Also, modern grids are designed with redundancy, yes, but redundancy is not invincibility. Redundancy means you can reroute some load for some time. But if the strike hits the right node, you don't get a clean outage. You get frequency instability, protective shutdowns, rolling blackouts, systems tripping to avoid catastrophic failure. So the fear isn't just what exploded, the fear is what can't be restored quickly, not with speeches, not with censorship, not with optimism, only with hardware and time. Let's translate this from systems engineering to the human body. A human requires a minimum of 3 liters of potable water per day for basic survival under stress, more in a hot, crowded urban environment without air conditioning. 4 million people means a baseline daily need of 12 million liters. That's not water for drinking. That's water for drinking, minimal hygiene to prevent disease outbreaks, and basic cooking. Now consider the logistics. A standard water tanker truck carries about 30,000 liters. To meet the bare minimum for Tel Aviv, you would need 400 tanker trucks arriving every single day, distributed across a sprawling metropolitan area with traffic systems already compromised by power loss, no traffic lights, no fuel pump power at stations. That's before we account for hospitals, which require exponentially more. But here's the cumulative pressure. This isn't happening in a vacuum. Israel's ports have faced prior threats. Its domestic fuel reserves are finite. Its emergency management protocols were designed for localized, temporary outages, not a metropolitan-scale sustained disconnection from its primary desalination and power nexus. Supermarket shelves, which rely on just-in-time delivery and refrigerated trucks, will see panic buying empty them in hours, not days. The first 24 hours are about confusion. The next 48 are about the breakdown of social order as the biological imperative for water overrides all other rules. This is why the target was chosen with such cold precision. You don't need to destroy every desal plant. You only need to break the pressure grid, the network of pumps and reservoirs that push water to the plants and from them to the city. Without stable, high-voltage power, those pumps fail. The water in the reservoirs drains. The reverse osmosis systems shut down to avoid damage. And the city begins a countdown, not measured in days of inconvenience, but in hours until the first neighborhoods go dry. The logistics of emergency response, truck convoys, mobile purification units, cannot scale to a 4 million person metropolitan failure. The roads become clogged. Security forces are diverted to protect water distribution points, not from external attack, but from desperate citizens. This is the mechanism of societal collapse, not a single dramatic event, but the silent, grinding failure of 1,000 small pipes. Now follow the water into the hospitals. Major medical centers like Tel Aviv Sourasky, Ichilov, and Sheba are not just buildings with generators. They are biological ecosystems dependent on a continuous high-quality utility stream. Surgical units require sterile water for instrument washing, patient prep, and hemodialysis. A single dialysis session uses 300 to 500 liters of ultra-pure water. Without it, patients with renal failure die within 72 hours. There is no stockpile for a city of this scale. Infection prevention collapses without water pressure. Toilets backflow. Surfaces cannot be cleaned. In a crowded, stressed population, this turns a hospital from a place of healing into a vector for a cholera or hepatitis outbreak within a week. Pharmaceuticals and vaccines require constant refrigeration. Power outages breach the cold chain. Insulin, antibiotics, blood products, all spoil. The neonatal intensive care units, with their delicate life support systems, are the first to face impossible triage decisions when generator fuel runs low and must be conserved for ventilators. The most vulnerable, the elderly in high-rises without water to drink or flush toilets, infants, the chronically ill, become a silent mortality wave. Their deaths won't be from missiles. They'll be listed as complications of infrastructure failure or exacerbation of pre-existing conditions. This is the hidden calculus of modern warfare, the weaponization of metabolic time. And remember, medical staff are also part of this population. They are trying to get to hospitals through traffic chaos, worrying about their own family's water supply, and operating under the psychological weight of knowing every decision is a rationing choice. The system doesn't just break, it ethically unravels. What we are witnessing is not an information blackout due to operational security. That is the official framing. The reality is an incapacity blackout, a vacuum born of a government that has no coherent narrative because it has no coherent response. Contrast this with a standard military crisis. A base is hit, officials provide casualty figures, a retaliation plan is hinted at. Here the target is the city's life support. What does the government say? We are assessing damage? Citizens should remain calm? Those phrases are meaningless when a mother knows her child hasn't had clean water in 18 hours. The silence is not strategic, it is paralytic. It reveals a fundamental truth. The state's communication apparatus was built for managing perception during military events, not for governing during a civilizational failure. They have no playbook for telling 4 million people that the tap may not run for a week, that the grid may not be restored in a month, and that the state cannot guarantee basic survival. This silence is a political weapon in itself. It seeds the narrative to panic, rumor, and social media speculation, which is often more accurate in the first hours than any official statement. It tells the populace, we do not have the answers. We are not in control. The historical precedent is chilling. In disasters from Hurricane Katrina to the Beirut port explosion, the first 24-48 hours of official silence or obfuscation directly correlated with a collapse in public trust and a surge in chaotic, self-preserving behavior. The government isn't hiding a plan. It is hiding the absence of a plan that matches the scale of the biological threat. This attack crosses a legal and diplomatic threshold. Under Additional Protocol I to the Geneva Conventions, Article 54, objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as drinking water installations and supplies, are protected from attack. The prohibition is clear. Starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited. The destruction of the water pressure nexus in a desert metropolis is not collateral damage. It is a direct attack on the means of survival. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, will be activated, but their ability to intervene is limited without Israeli consent and a cessation of hostilities to allow aid corridors. The moment a state's own infrastructure is the weaponized target, the traditional humanitarian model, focused on conflict zones and cross-border aid, breaks down. The humanitarian space is inside the attacking state's own territory. Allied reactions will be a study in geopolitical triage. The U.S., while committed to Israel's defense, will face immediate pressure from its own agencies, USAID, State Department, to facilitate technical assistance and pressure for de-escalation. European nations will issue statements framing this as an unacceptable escalation against civilian infrastructure, potentially triggering reviews of arms export licenses or diplomatic downgrades. The shift is profound, from attacks on military capacity to attacks on biological continuity. This reframes the conflict from a regional security issue to a test of international norms on total warfare. The world's response will signal whether those norms still hold, or whether we have silently accepted that the infrastructure of modern life is now a legitimate battlefield. This is where the pressure becomes political, and the political becomes existential, because this strike doesn't land on a clean slate. It lands on top of everything already fraying. Closed airspace scares investors before it scares tourists. Previous rocket salvos already forced rolling school closures and repeated shelter alerts. Earlier strain on the power grid normalized emergency generators and fuel queues. The economy absorbed shipping delays, higher insurance premiums, disrupted workdays, and reserve call-ups that pulled skilled labor out of hospitals, factories, and IT. Then came the quiet secondary impacts: canceled surgeries, shrinking small business cash flow, exhausted civil defense teams, and families living with one eye on the phone, one ear on the siren. This is not one crisis, not one outage. Not one incident, but a stack, each layer making the next failure easier, faster, and harder to contain. And now the stack reaches the level that changes state legitimacy. Basic utilities. Because when a government cannot guarantee water pressure and electricity stability in its largest urban hub, the argument stops being ideological and becomes primal. This is the moment the phrase resilience risks becoming a slogan people spit back in anger. This is the threshold where a nation doesn't just face escalation, it faces the possibility of civilizational collapse, not overnight, but in cascading, humiliating increments. War planners talk in military time, hours to retaliate, days to mobilize, weeks to reshape the battlefield, but Tel Aviv is now on a different timer. This is not a military clock, it's a biological clock. If water pressure drops, dehydration doesn't announce itself like a siren. It creeps in: headaches, confusion, aggression, poor judgment. A city becomes more accident-prone, more volatile, more combustible, because human cognition is chemistry, and chemistry requires water. If sanitation fails, disease doesn't wait for diplomacy. If fuel logistics choke, generators stop, elevators freeze, and high-rises become vertical traps for the elderly. If refrigeration fails, insulin becomes useless plastic, and food becomes waste. So the central question isn't who struck whom. It's how long can millions of people live inside a modern city that is slowly reverting to pre-industrial constraints? Israel has roughly 9 million citizens. Tel Aviv is a dense nervous system inside that body. If the system shifts from targeted disruption to sustained infrastructure denial, you don't get a clean victory or defeat. You get a long, dark experiment in how quickly order can hollow out when the essentials, water, power, truth, are no longer reliable. So I want to ask you 2 questions, because the answer determines what kind of war this becomes. First, if civilian survival infrastructure is now a deliberate target, is this still deterrence? Or is it the opening of total warfare by other means? Not tanks, not trenches, but biology. Second, does government silence prevent panic? Or does it accelerate collapse by leaving people to fill the vacuum with rumor and fear? Put your analysis in the comments. I'm reading them and I'll pull the strongest points into the next breakdown. If you want clear system-level coverage as this develops, subscribe, hit like, and click the video on screen, because what happens next won't be decided only by missiles, but by how societies endure the hours after impact.